Hello. Hi, everyone. This is the third installment of our lectures for the fall break weekend. This should put us up to the point that we need to be at to start classes on Tuesday again. So just reiterating what we talked about in the last video, we were discussing the death of Caesar and by the Senate. He was assassinated in the Senate. And we're going to talk about what came after. So let's proceed to our next topic here. And that is the second triumvirate. Remember, Caesar was part of the first triumvirate, and it was him and Crassus and Pompey. So our second triumvirate is made up of a few new people that we'll be talking about. So after the death of Caesar, there was really no going back to the good old days of the Republic. The legacy that Caesar left was too influential, and he had altered too much. So who or what would follow Caesar? And that is answered in our second triumvirate. The first member of the second triumvirate was Mark Antony. He's one of Caesar's officers and an excellent soldier. He was particularly popular amongst the troops and the Roman population, particularly because of his famous oration at Caesar's funeral, in which Shakespeare kind of recounts it to us, and we have kind of this famous quote from it. It says, he's giving this funeral oration in front of Caesar's body, and he says, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." And so it's this famous funeral oration that he's giving, that he's really kind of really appeals to the people of Rome. And then our second member of the triumvirate, of the second triumvirate, is Octavian. And this is the only living male relative of Julius Caesar. It is his great nephew. Caesar actually named Octavian, who at the time was 17 years old, as his heir in his will. So Octavian was supposed to inherit all of Caesar's lands, goods, and money. But he also inherited all of Caesar's goodwill with the people and the army, it would seem. But Octavian and Mark Antony are rivals, but both were opposed to the Senate, so they teamed up with another of Caesar's former generals, Lepidus, and together they formed the second triumvirate. And this was formed in about early 43 BC. So less than a year after the assassination of Caesar, we have a second triumvirate that kind of comes together to fill that power vacuum. And so the second triumvirate is supported by the troops of Julius Caesar. And these three guys march on Rome, where they force the Senate to name them as an official government body, as co-dictators, meaning that they have the power to make law and they have military command as well. And now this was supposed to be a partnership for justice, for vengeance, and for political advancement. But they had also made lots of enemies along the way, and were sort of enemies as well. But together, much like with the first triumvirate, they were hoping that their shared purpose of kind of wanting revenge would be enough to bind them. So one of the things that they do once they take over the Senate is they send out another list of proscriptions. Remember, those are the death lists that they put out against their political enemies. So there's almost 3,000 senators and aristocrats who are put on this list, including Cicero, who is one of the assassins of Caesar. Cicero is a great Roman lawyer. He's an orator. We have one of his defense of the assassination of Caesar as one of our primary sources. He essentially is saying that Caesar was a tyrant and that the senators did what they had to do to defend the Republic. But obviously, Mark Antony and Octavian had different opinions on Cicero's role in that. But Cicero also spoke up very loudly against Antony. And he thought he could turn Octavian against Antony, but he failed to do this. And Cicero ended up making an even bigger enemy out of Octavian and Antony after this failed sort of subversive attempt to kind of break up that second triumvirate. And so his name was put on this proscription list, and he was one of the first to die when this proscription list was put out. And at the request of Mark Antony, his hands and his head were nailed to the door of the Senate because his hands had written the the speech against Caesar. So Mark Antony especially wanted kind of this revenge against him. And in 42 BC, Mark Antony and Octavian defeated the forces of Crassus and Brutus, so the leaders of the assassination of Caesar. They defeated these two men, Brutus and Cassius, at the Battle of Philippi. And as a result, both of these men, instead of being captured or being made to submit to Mark Antony and Octavian, both of these men committed an honorable suicide, which at the time in Rome, it was considered an honorable thing to do rather than dishonor your family name. And so after this defeat of the two main proponents of the death of Caesar, the Triumvirate decided that they were going to divide up the empire and essentially rule individual areas. So Octavian was given imperium, so he was given kind of that power of the consul over Italy, and he stays in Rome. Mark Antony was given imperium over the East, and he was able to consolidate Roman control of the East, including Egypt. So kind of our former Persian lands, Greece, as well as Egypt. And then Lepidus is given imperium over most of Africa, except Egypt. And from the beginning, there were tensions within the Triumvirate, including Lepidus, who was essentially forced out of power very quickly. He was arrested by Octavian's men and forced into home imprisonment for the rest of his life. And Octavian is really kind of working against Mark Antony as well. Octavian tries to present himself as this defender of traditional Roman values. He goes about building temples to the gods in Rome and around Italy. He builds a huge family tomb for himself that looks like an old Etruscan tomb, so kind of like hearkening back to the old days. But one of the things that he does is he starts spreading rumors about Mark Antony. And I've actually found a video that is pretty interesting that I want to show you guys. It is from the TV show Rome that was put out by HBO. It's a very interesting TV show, and it's a pretty good rendition of what life in Rome at this time period would have been like. But this is kind of a documentary put together by the creators and the historians for the show, talking about the interaction between Octavian and Mark Antony during this time period. So we're gonna listen to like a 3.5-minute video with them. There are various clips from the TV show Rome that are superimposed into it. So just understand that those are there for a reason.
Antony was first and foremost a soldier and a man of action. Octavian thought and saw the way that Roman society was going, saw that himself could take control of this very unstable and chaotic system and make it work. The thing about Octavian is that he was an unbelievably astute politician, just a brilliant genius for understanding other people, psychologically so acute, knows how to read people, particularly their weaknesses, and use them.
Been ordered by Triumvirate Mark Antony to escort you both back to your ship and to make sure that you leave Alexandria as soon as the wind allows.
That's him again. He turns away the mother of his child.
That's correct.
When Antony rekindles the relationship with Cleopatra, already married, Octavia is openly humiliated.
Romans were very xenophobic people. His refusal to reconcile with his wife was used by Octavian as propaganda. He's no longer a real Roman, he has become Egyptian.
Octavian's response is simply...
Just to insert a little bit of background information here. One of the ways that Octavian and Mark Antony tried to seal up their the triumvirate was that Mark Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. But when Mark Antony goes to Egypt, he ends up living openly in Alexandria with Cleopatra kind of as his wife, and they have several children together. And Octavian, as he's starting to kind of move against Mark Antony, uses this relationship and Mark Antony's kind of adoption of Eastern kind of Persian-esque Egyptian qualities against him. So he kind of uses his propaganda machine against Mark Antony, saying that he's taken to this Eastern life, that he's got those Persian qualities that the Greeks and the Romans don't like. You know, he's kind of effeminate. And so he uses this relationship with his the marriage between Mark Antony and his sister against Mark Antony.
To use his by then extremely formidable propaganda machine to step up the war against Antony.
This was something that people could understand. He's divorced his wife, he's divorced his decent Roman wife, and is shacked up with a crazy Egyptian witch. The most brilliant example of Antony propaganda would be Virgil at the Aeneid.
He captures that whole sense of this weird world, this bizarre and dark.
Poor Octavian.
So this battle of Actium, because of the growing tension between Mark Antony and Octavian, essentially another civil war erupts in the Roman Empire between the two of these men in 32 BC. And in 31 BC, we have the Battle of Actium, which is a naval and a land battle that is fought between Octavian's forces and then Antony and Cleopatra's forces. Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra at the Navy Battle of Actium, and Antony and Cleopatra escape back to Alexandria, but they are followed by Octavian and his troops. And hearing that they are on their way, Mark Antony hears a rumor that Cleopatra has committed suicide. So Mark Antony then commits suicide. But as it turns out, Cleopatra actually wasn't dead. She tries to strike a deal with Octavian to, continue being the pharaoh over Egypt. However, Octavian refuses to consider any such deal, and as a result, Cleopatra then commits suicide as well, perhaps by using a poisonous snake.
Point being, Cleopatra leaves. She can do Octavian as she did Antony and Caesar. She can seduce him too. She miscalculates. She can't. And as soon as she realizes that, meeting him, then she knows the jig is up and she takes her own life.
Is it better that everyone has a voice rather than it was chaos, or is it better that one man tyrannizes over everyone else and brings peace and order? Octavian solved the question by creating a system which was the appearance of democracy, but he ran it as a one-man show.
I effected kind of revolution, back to basics campaign. He wanted to encourage marriage and to pass laws that were draconian against the commission of adultery. With the wealth of Egypt coming back in, with the grain from Egypt coming back in, with there no need to raise armies, with there no internecine civil strife, everything starts to come back to life for Rome. Both Rome the city, Italy, and the Roman world. There's fabulous building going on. Rome starts to convert and transform itself architecturally. Augustus later, in the work that he wrote at the end of his life, made the famous book, I found Rome, the city of brick, and the city of marble.
Okay. So, all right, guys. So we are going to continue on from here, but I hope that video kind of gives you a little bit more of a feel for what is going on in Egypt at this time, and kind of the fighting in between Octavian and Mark Antony. So this Battle of Actium essentially represents the end of the civil wars between the triumvirates. And secondly, it also marks the end of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Thereafter, Egypt, which had been the last independent Hellenistic kingdom, it was completely absorbed into the Roman Empire. And so what Alexander the Great had created with his empire building, Egypt was the last standing of the Ptolemaic era, and was completely absorbed under Roman's power after the suicide of Cleopatra. And thirdly, the victory at Actium marked the end of the Roman Republic, as Octavian emerged to dominate the government of Rome. In other words, it meant the beginning of one-man rule within Rome. That is why 31 BC marks the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Okay. So after the Battle of Actium, Octavian became the most important man in Roman history. He maintained control of the Roman state for the rest of his life. He was dominant from 31 BC to 14 CE. So during those 43 years, he reorganized the Roman government to give permanent control to one man. He was the first Roman emperor. Or was he? He benefited from hindsight of seeing what had happened to Caesar when Caesar attempted to become a one-man ruler. And so what Octavian does is he actually refuses the title of dictator. He never took any official position that could have been used to claim he was trying to make himself a king or a tyrant. He also creates a new system of government that functioned just below the old system, just below the surface of the old system. That way he can maintain the fiction that Rome was still a republic. It had its assemblies, the Senate, the consuls, and that it wasn't being ruled by him, a single man. But in fact, that's what was happening. Octavian, after the defeat of Mark Antony and the victory at Actium, Octavian made a proclamation that he would give up all of his power and return it to the Senate and the people of Rome. This worked like reverse psychology. He offers to give up power so that they willingly grant him more power. So the Senate grants him the title of Augustus, which means the most honorable, revered, or illustrious. And so Octavian changes his name from Octavian to Caesar Augustus. And in this, he's trying to control his image very tightly and kind of dictate how he's going to be remembered. The Senate also grants him the role of consul for 10 years. And after 10 years, he resigns because this is a very lengthy stay for a consul. And he was worried that his length as consul was becoming unpopular and was bordering on dictator. So he had the role of consul, he was granted it, but he gives it up after 10 years. And after those first 10 years as consul, when he gives that up, he is granted the title of princeps, which means the first citizen, a first amongst equals. This word eventually becomes what the word prince means in European society. This was Augustus's favorite title and how he wanted himself to be viewed, not a single ruler or a dictator, simply the first amongst equals, ruling for the greater good. And from this point on, I will try to be referring to Octavian now as Augustus or Caesar Augustus. So if I slip up, I apologize. But since the Senate had made him consul for 10 years, which meant he was in charge of the army for 10 years straight, he also took the title of imperator. This is a title that's given to the consul or a general when they were going to war. It gave them ultimate authority over the army. And this is the word that emperor comes from. So it's the title of imperator that leads into the title of emperor eventually. But Augustus is not just granted these titles. He's also granted the title of pater patere, which means the father of the fatherland. He's also made a tribune. So he's technically a representative from the People's Assembly to the Senate. And as tribune, he could use his tribunal power to block any undesirable action by the Senate. Moreover, all Roman leaders had to swear an oath that they would not harm the tribune in any way because his body was considered sacred. So this was another way that he was kind of ensuring that what happened to Caesar does not happen to him as well. He's also made the Pontificus Maximus, which means he's the religious leader within the Roman religion. And he's also made elected censor, which means he approves all of the candidates who run for political office. He approves them for the elections, and it also gives him control over what's being published in the popular sphere, so like plays and writings and things like that. But as censor, he's able to control who's running for political office, so who is part of that honoris curium, the public offices that people have to hold in order to be considered a member of the Senate eventually. And so with all of these offices, Augustus did not rule alone. Besides him, there were regular consuls that were elected every year. There were the other 9 tribunes that were elected. There were other censors who had been elected. But his prestige and his military support enabled him to control who would be elected in those positions with him. Moreover, since he held all of these jobs at once, he had more authority than any other Roman. In theory, he was elected to all of these offices, although the election was, in reality, only a formality. And so one of the things he does is he starts to reorganize the administration over the empire, making it a far more effective bureaucracy. He staffs this bureaucracy with paid employees that were answerable to him. So this gave Romans another chance of advancement in society besides being elected to office or serving in the army. So he's created kind of that third option. So you can run for political office and serve the Rome that way. You can serve in the army that way. And now you can serve within the bureaucracy as well. So the biggest question to ask is, when it comes to Augustus, is why did the Senate give up so much power to Augustus when they'd been so willing to assassinate Caesar at the first inclination that Caesar was going for one-man rule? Why hand over their prerogatives, their privileges, and share ruling? Was it a fear that assassination would lead to more bloodshed? Or were they just simply accepting that Rome was no longer the old republic it had once been, and that too much had changed? A lot of historians believe that the people of Rome at this point were sick of the civil wars. If you think back, starting with the age of the generals, or even with Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, we have murder and bloodshed in the streets, violence within politics that are happening. We have the proscription lists under Sulla. You had the civil war under Marius, the civil war between the first triumvirate and the second triumvirate. So maybe they were just willing to accept Augustus because it maybe meant an end of civil wars. We don't know. But what we do know is that they certainly willingly granted him all of these titles. So as consul, for 10 years, so Augustus was consul from 31 to 23 BCE. Augustus had full control over the army. And control over the army meant that he could control what was happening in those far-flung provinces. Traditionally speaking, the Senate had chosen the governors of these provinces, and this had led to widespread corruption. One of the reasons that the Age of Generals was able to happen was because we had this widespread corruption in the provinces. But Augustus had the Senate divide the provinces into two separate groups. In the older provinces, which were less likely to encounter trouble, he allowed the Senate to continue to appoint those governors, as they always had. And since he had the power of consul, he could easily, occasionally check those governors. He wouldn't have to supervise them as closely all the time, and they would not have the occasion to fight very often, so they didn't have to be given that much power. And the second group of provinces were the newer provinces, and this is where the possibility of war was far more likely. Augustus himself was made the governor of all of these different provinces. So he was given the governorship of over a half a dozen Roman provinces. And what he did is he appointed assistants to go out and rule those provinces for him. They were responsible to him, and he could remove them from office at any time for any reason that he wished. And they could not fight without his authorization. And so through this device of controlling those very important provinces, Augustus was able to keep control over the army and keep that title of an imperator. And so after the civil wars that he was involved in, he reduced the size of the Roman army from around 700,000 men to about 350,000 men. So he breaks it down by about half. And so what he does with these discharged soldiers is that he gives them lands in those newly conquered provinces. So like Gaul and Spain and Asia Minor and in Britain, those areas. And so these retired soldiers move with their families and their dependents and servants to set up farms and communities and establish an economy in these far off places. And this move acts to solve several problems. Giving these soldiers lands ensures that trained soldiers are now guarding those lands. So he's not paying them as soldiers, but they're essentially guarding the lands as if they were soldiers. So he's kind of getting a double bang for his buck, essentially. And so with the remaining army forces, he assigns those to the provinces that he is the governor of, because those are the provinces where war is more likely to break out. So that's where the army is needed. The rest he uses to guard the frontiers of the empire, so the far western and eastern areas especially. He also starts to pay wages to the army. Previously, they had been citizens, but now it's turning into a professional army with wages. And meanwhile, the Republic is still growing, even though the civil wars are over. Rome is still expanding. Egypt had been added as a province to the Roman Empire and not just a partner. So we added Egypt recently with the death of Cleopatra. So that's a huge amount of land and wealth and grain. Remember how fertile the lands of Egypt are because of the Nile floodplains. So all of that is now feeding into Rome and providing for that growing population. But Augustus kept Egypt as his own personal province. And so a lot of the money from Egypt is going directly into his pocket, which allows him to fund other building projects and to look like a very gracious imperator to those people in Rome. So he uses this money coming from Egypt to just further enhance himself as this first citizen of Rome, doing all of these good things, putting his money back into the building of Roman elegance and architecture and engineering, things like that. He also pushes the borders of Rome to the north as well as in the south. But this idea of Augustus as this first amongst equals is definitely a creation of his propaganda machine. It's a desirable fiction that he creates. And it's probably one of the most remarkable things about Augustus's reorganization of the Roman state is that people didn't really realize that it's moving from a republic to an imperial government. It was this kind of a desirable arrangement. And one of the reasons why it was still desirable is that Augustus didn't abolish any of the older offices or the organs of government. He allowed them to continue, but under his close personal supervision. It was important that that these offices continue because Romans place a very high value, a high honor on the ability to hold those offices and to be able to sit in the Senate or sit in the assemblies. And so the honor of being a consul or being governor or being a senator was still available for those old patrician families and for our plebeians who are kind of becoming these new men that are working their way up through the curious honorum. And so they continue to support Augustus because he's continuing to allow them to act as if the republic is still there and that they still have those options for advancement. But Augustus could control who was selected for these offices in Rome because he was the censor. And he could also decide who was in the Senate because he controlled who was up for election. Moreover, Augustus used this control to get the support of men who would cooperate with him and his agenda. So members of traditional families had to accept this arrangement if they were to be allowed to advance in politics. Augustus also helped to broaden the base of the government by supporting men for offices who would have normally been excluded during the Republic. So he promoted men from other parts of Italy who had only recently received Roman citizenship. So he's bringing in kind of our provinces and people from those ranks into the actual functioning of the Roman government. And one of the things he does is he actually creates a census for the entire empire to understand what resources and people there are. And this census essentially decides that there's about 100 million people within the Roman Empire around the turn of the BC CE time period. And about 3/4 of that are living outside of Italy. So only a small portion of the Roman Empire is living in Italy. And Rome itself has about 500,000 people within the city limits. And so this period of Augustus, the Roman government ceases to be a city-state government or a republic, and it becomes an imperial government run by one man. Augustus managed to control his own image during his lifetime, and this helped to prevent the public from thinking that he was in fact ruling Rome as single man rule. He did this partly through his role as censor, but by controlling what was published, but also by patronizing certain men who supported his rule, that controlled the propaganda. These authors could sway the Roman Republic or the Roman public in his favor. So some of these authors that Augustus patronized are Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, which is a retelling of Rome's early history and gives Rome a claim to the antiquity that Greece had, going back to Homer's Iliad. We also have another author, Livy, who wrote the history of Rome. It was written in a prose format. And it kind of talks about, the breaking away from the Etruscans and stories of Romans sacrificing themselves for the liberty of Rome. But Augustus himself also kind of throws his hat into the ring and writes some propaganda himself. Shortly before his death, he wrote Res Gesta Divia Augusti, which means the divine achievements of Augustus. This is essentially, he writes this because it's how he wants himself to be remembered. He highlights the things that he thinks are most important about his time, as kind of this first amongst equals. And now the divine achievements of Augustus are one of the primary sources for this course. I encourage you to read over it and just read the words that Augustus himself wanted people to remember about him. So this is his attempt to create his own memory, and how people would think about him in the future. So it's a really important source for us to pull from. And other ways that Augustus builds up his propaganda is he commissions many statues to be built of himself. And he makes these statues to present himself in a military regalia to emphasize his role as imperator, as the leader of the army. He also has himself commissioned wearing religious robes to show his religious role as the Pontificus Maximus of the Roman religion. He dresses kind of like these priests and priestesses to sort of link them to the gods a bit, hoping to kind of get their favor. But he uses his enormous wealth to improve the city of Rome. He funds infrastructure building projects that put people to work, but also serves to make transportation and trade easier. He builds more roads, he paves them, which makes it easier to travel, but it also makes it easier for the army to move from one place to the other quicker. He builds many harbors along the coastlines. He builds bridges, reservoirs, temples, theaters, anything to kind of encourage the culture of Rome and to keep the people of Rome on his side. Augustus also encouraged the return to simpler times, back to Rome's past when Rome was a republic. So he wants to kind of bring back the morals and ideals of this simpler time. So he finds people who could take up religious positions and revive the religious nature of the empire. He resurrects some of the old ancient cults and priesthoods. He returns to traditional Roman values. You know, remember when we talked about Cato and how he was concerned that Rome was losing its Romanness because of all of the Greeks and the Greek culture that was flowing in. Well, this is something that Augustus is trying to do as well, is kind of bring Rome back to its Romanness. So he encourages a return to traditional Roman values, even though he himself was kind of not doing that. He passes laws that strengthen the family. He gives the paterfamilia more authority. He passes legislation to enforce moral behavior. He kind of engages in some social engineering. He passes anti-adultery laws to enforce marriages and to kind of stop the increasing rate of divorce that's happening in Rome. He actually exiles his own daughter because she refuses to conform to some of these moral behavior changes that he does. He rewards Roman women for giving birth to at least 3 children. And this was his way of encouraging the production of Roman children to increase the population of those old, powerful Roman families, and increasing the amount of people who could actually fight in Roman armies and expanding kind of those Roman influence over the rest of the world. He also kind of creates this idea of Romanization. So he's creating a more Roman system where people would feel like they're a part of the larger Roman complex. So he's spreading Roman culture to all areas of the empire, including those newly taken provinces. So in these new provinces, they encourage the worship of the emperor as a guardian of Rome, as the protector of the empire, kind of like the paterfamilias, but over the entire empire. Every major city has to build a temple where the emperor is worshipped. There are images displayed in these temples in numerous ways. Augustus eventually kind of claims descent from the goddess Venus. So there are statues of Cupid that are kind of put around because of that connection there. Local people in these new provinces are required to worship the emperor, as well as other gods within the pantheon. The only people who are given an exemption to worship the emperor are the Jews in Judea. They are not forced to worship. They initially refused because they were monotheist, and Augustus allows them to continue with their monotheistic religion and not having to worship the emperor to maintain a peace. The ruler needs gods on their sides and needs to be associated with the gods. And Augustus knew this. And so he feels that this connection to the gods gives him more authority to his proclamation and his rules. Remember, Hammurabi claimed that the laws that he was given were given to him by the Mesopotamian gods, particularly Marduk. So again, this claiming of laws coming from the gods is a common thing. But one thing that Augustus didn't do, he planned so many different things, but what he didn't do is plan properly for what would happen after his death. He had set up the Roman system in such a way that it couldn't be effectively ruled as a republic anymore. His power had been made to appear legal. He received all of his offices from the Senate and the Assembly. And having set this precedent, all future leaders had to receive their power in the same way. In theory, emperors were elected. They were not hereditary monarchs. Romans hated monarchy, but they loved Augustus, and he brought back prosperity and he brought back peace after centuries of civil war and social unrest. For so many Romans didn't remember the time when the Republic was ruling. They only remembered being ruled under a single man rule. Could the system he created survive without him, without his charisma, without his personality? I guess we'll see. So when Augustus dies in 14 CE, he was hailed as a savior, that he had brought peace and prosperity to the empire. But the one problem he left was the question of succession. When an emperor dies, who takes his place? If we're not going to do it with monarchy where it's hereditary, how is it going to be done? He also left no sons by his wife. He had a single daughter, Julia, the one he had exiled because she wasn't going to conform to his moral restrictions. And her sons had died before Augustus did. So he didn't have any legitimate heirs. So Augustus indicated that his stepson, Tiberius, should succeed him. And to ensure this, he made Tiberius divorce the wife he had and marry his daughter, Julia, to reinforce kind of this adoptive connection. So he forces his daughter to marry his stepson to kind of create those family ties and that cohesion a little bit. So an interesting take on his rule. Now, as I previously mentioned, the Roman Empire lasted from about 31 BC until 476 CE, which is a period of about 500 years. So the republic that Augustus took and turned into an empire, that empire lasts for about 500 years. And one of the most remarkable aspects was that for about 100 years after Augustus, the empire was characterized with peace and stability and prosperity. And this period is known as Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And it is the longest period of general peace that the Western world has ever known. However, these 100 years didn't come immediately after Augustus's death. The first 70 years following the death of Augustus, there remained a fair amount of instability and turbulence. And I'm going to talk about those in just a second. So I'm going to pull up a new PowerPoint here. And we are going to talk about the empire that came after Augustus. So you can see on this map here, kind of the empire that we are dealing with. What's in pink is the empire that was in existence at the death of Augustus. So a huge amount of land was under his rule at the time of his death. And the darker orange is the greatest extent of the Roman Empire under Trajan, which was one of our good emperors. So let's move forward from this. Okay. So in the first place, right after the death of Augustus, there was a fair amount of political instability during the period of the Julio-Claudian emperors, which is the name for the dynasty that came after Augustus. This time period was characterized by cruelty, violence, corruption, and waste. The Julio-Claudian dynasty produced some really terrible leaders, including Caligula and Nero. They're from this line. Caligula was an emperor who was quite insane. He was incredibly paranoid and unstable. He wasted immense wealth on gladiatorial games and chariot races throughout the streets of Rome. He even appointed his favorite horse to the consulship of the Senate. But considering how bad Caligula was, Nero was far worse. He was the meanest person to ever be emperor. He used his power to kill those that he felt were against him, including his own mother, his wife, his teachers, senators, etc. In 63 CE, when Nero was emperor, a huge fire erupted in Rome and many blocks of housing were destroyed. Nero used this cleared land that had been destroyed in that fire to build a huge golden palace for himself. So many accused him of setting the fire simply so that he would have a space to build his golden palace. People accused him of fiddling while Rome burned. Now, he blamed the new religious cult coming out of Judea, the Christians, for the fire instead. And this actually leads to the first persecutions of Christians in Rome. And we'll get to more details about that next week when we talk about Christianity. Eventually, the generals in the army rebelled against Nero, and along with the Senate, they caught him and they arrested him. And because he didn't want himself to be killed by the Senate, Nero orders the servant that they arrested with him to kill him instead. And so Nero dies in 69 CE rather than being captured or executed by the Senate. And now, after the death of Nero, there was another civil war. In the year 69 CE, there were 4 emperors, 2 of which were murdered and a third who committed suicide. Now, there are other reasons for turmoil going on in the 1st century CE after the death of Augustus, and that is due to a massive uprising of Jews in Judea, which broke out in 66 CE. And as a result of this Jewish uprising, Roman forces in the year 70 destroyed the city of Jerusalem, including the temple. So remember when the Jews in Jerusalem had been captured by the Babylonians, and they had been exiled out of Judea and brought back to Babylon during that Babylonian captivity. Well, when Cyrus the Great took over that empire, he had helped them rebuild the temple. And it is that rebuilt temple that Cyrus the Great had helped the Jews build. That is what was destroyed by the Roman troops in the year 70 CE. So the city of Jerusalem is destroyed, as is their temple. And now this uprising of Jews in Judea reached a tragic climax in the year 73 CE. 3 years prior, back in 70 CE, a group of approximately 900 zealots and their families took refuge in a fortress located on top of a mountain. And it was a fortress called Masada. And you can see it in these images here on the PowerPoint. So for 3 years, these 900 zealots and their family members had managed to hold out. So for 3 years, but in 73 CE, the Romans managed to storm the fortress of Masada. However, when they breached the walls, they found almost everyone dead. They were all the victims of a mass suicide. Indeed, the men had killed their wives and children and then themselves. They had chosen suicide before they would submit to Rome's authority. It says a lot. And in general, this Roman suppression of the Jewish revolt intensified a process that had begun years before, the diaspora, in which Jews were forced to live away from their traditional homelands in Palestine. And in third place, another reason why this 1st century was so chaotic is that there was a massive volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius on August 24th, 79 CE, which devastated the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Within 1 day, both cities were literally buried under about 20 feet of volcanic ash. And this instability began to end around the year 96 CE. And it begins in 96 CE because there emerged a series of emperors who become known as the 5 good emperors. So in the period of the 5 good emperors, it began by election. So our Senate actually elects an emperor. They elect Nerva as emperor. His reign is fairly short, but it's extremely significant because he introduced a political solution for the problem of succession. A temporary solution, but a solution nonetheless. Specifically, Nerva adopted as his son and designated as his heir a younger man of proven ability as a general and a politician, and this man was Trajan. And later, Trajan did the same thing. He adopted as his designated heir another man of proven ability, Hadrian. So we're going to talk a little bit about Hadrian. So Hadrian was born or ruled from 117 to 138 CE. He was a successful general and he had a very long career. He didn't like a static lifestyle. He wanted to travel with the troops, the garrisons. He wanted to travel from fort to fort. He spent most of his 20 years as emperor traveling around the empire on horseback, actually. He was very concerned with the northern borders and the barbarians that lay beyond. These German tribes were really putting pressure on the northern borders. These frontiers, especially along the rivers, were very well guarded. There was not much fighting, but there was fear amongst the Romans that the threat that these German tribes could pose. Hadrian tried to make the army legions leaner and meaner. And as a result of his attempts to kind of fix the army actually ends up growing in size after that trimming that Augustus had done. More conquest had happened after the death of Augustus, and so the army is growing as the empire is expanding. But Hadrian tries to really kind of institute more discipline and professionalization within the army itself. He insisted that throughout the provinces, there would be complete Roman bureaucracy in place, that there would be a governor, administration, tax collectors, etc. So he really puts emphasis on this efficient bureaucracy that had been started under Augustus, but had fallen off during some of those first 70 years, those first 50 years or so when it was a little bit more chaotic. So once he has this effective imperial state in place, the empire was larger and it was better run, better defended. It was more prosperous than when he came to the throne. He had been a very good governor or good emperor of the empire. He also sought to improve the welfare of the people within the empire. He passed laws against child abuse, he passed laws on how slaves should be treated. He established schools, he established pay for teachers. And this system that Hadrian had benefited from of kind of adopting a good successor, as opposed to assuming that a son or a hereditary heir would be good. This idea of adopting the next leader led to a succession of very competent emperors until the late 2nd century. So this system of good adoption ended in 180 with the death of the 5th good emperor, Marcus Aurelius, who designated as his heir his own son, Commodus, who was an idiot and a misfit. If anyone's ever seen the movie Gladiator, which I strongly encourage you to watch, it's a very good movie. Their old emperor at the beginning of this movie is Marcus Aurelius, and we really see kind of the twisted personality of his son, and kind of this myth that there was another general that he was going to designate, but that Commodus had actually killed his father before he could change his designation. But Marcus Aurelius, before he made the tragic decision to designate his own son as his heir, Marcus Aurelius had a brilliant military career. He was not just a military commander and emperor, but he was also very interested in Hellenistic culture, especially in philosophy. He was probably the most Hellenistic of the emperors. He was very enamored with Greek philosophy, Greek culture, and kind of just anything that was kind of coming out of Greece, that Hellenism that Alexander the Great had spread. That's something that Marcus Aurelius really appreciated. He also looked Hellenistic in his physical appearance. He wore his facial hair in kind of the Greek style. He was an admirer of Stoicism, living kind of an even life, a life in harmony, not wallowing in pleasure or displeasure, kind of life of moderation. He he believed it was his place in the universe to be emperor, to rule and to defend the empire well. He also propagated the Stoic values of duty and self-discipline, the importance placed on public service, of serving your empire. He also wrote a book of philosophy called Meditations. He spent a lot of time fighting wars in the eastern part of the empire against the, or rather the northeastern part of the empire against the Slavs and the German barbarians. That pressure that was being put on the northeastern border, the frontier by these tribes was ever increasing. And this was something that Marcus Aurelius was very concerned about. So in addition to the political stability that those 5 good emperors had created, there was also a lot of economic stability that was happening at this time period as well. The Romans established a common stable currency that was used throughout the empire. So they had a standard coin that was used and recognized everywhere, and it had the same value across the empire. So, you know, if you traded for a coin in northern Gaul, you would get the same amount of goods for that same coin in Egypt. So this really kind of stabilized trade and made things a little bit easier. We also had a standardization of the weight system across the empire. So again, a pound of grain was the same amount throughout the empire, as opposed to having various differences. There was also an active and vigorous trade that kind of came with this sort of peace of the 5 good emperors. So lots of goods were circulating through the empire. They had those nice paved roads to travel on. Things were safer. You had reliable coinage to trade for these goods. That kind of helped that. There were also new cities being built everywhere. We saw cities being established of Paris, of London, Vienna. All of these were originally Roman towns. And the older cities were growing and becoming wealthier and more established. The Romans built and maintained roads to encourage the growth of trade and movement. These Roman roads connected towns and cities. These roads facilitated trade and commerce and communications, but they also established the ability for the Roman troops to move quickly from place to place, so they could increase security in the empire. Sorry. So all of this helped to facilitate the spread of a distinctive, or a distinctive Roman style of culture. Romans never really developed much of a culture beyond their own values, at least in the early time of the Republic. Instead, their conquest of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Romans had acquired Greek culture, Hellenistic culture, Persian culture, Egyptian culture, the sciences from the East, and Eastern philosophies and Eastern art, Hellenistic literature. So throughout the Roman Republic, they had Hellenism, but they didn't really have their own culture. But gradually, throughout the empire time period, Romans become more creative and more distinctive. And so Roman culture starts reaching its height, its most brilliant expression during the Roman Empire, especially under the 5 good emperors. So in general, we're going to talk a little bit about the distinctive achievements in Roman culture, architecture, engineering, and law. So let us begin with Roman architecture. In general terms, Roman architecture was designed to reflect Roman power. Roman architecture was most characterized by its massive size and its solid construction. Like most people, the Romans built with brick and stone. However, their greatest contribution to architecture was their use of a new construction material and techniques, and most importantly, the Roman pioneering use of concrete. The use of concrete allowed Romans to develop certain forms and arcs and vaults that led to the construction of domes. Concrete was a new development, and obviously it's something that we still use today. So it was something that really enabled Rome to build higher and stronger and more beautiful buildings. Roman architecture was devoted primarily to serving practical purposes. For example, government buildings such as basilicas or public baths, which public baths were essentially like public health clubs. It's where you went to swim, where you went to exercise, things like that. But they also used their building practices to create race courses and temples and amphitheaters, so cultural as well as governmental buildings. The most incredible example of an amphitheater was the Colosseum, which is a stadium that was built to hold approximately 65,000 spectators. And it was used for gladiatorial fights, mock battles, executions, plays, things like that. It was just the Colosseum is a brilliant example of Roman engineering and architecture. And so closely related to Roman achievements in architecture and were achievements in engineering. In each significant town and city throughout the empire, the Romans built paved streets and durable roads between these towns. They also built bridges, canals, aqueducts, which carried water from the surrounding areas, from hills and lakes and rivers into the cities and towns. And many of these things still survive today. And some of them are still being used. You can see in the picture here in the bottom right, this is an aqueduct system in Spain that is still functioning to this day. So almost 2,000 years later. It's insane to think. But nevertheless, for all of the Rome's great achievements in architecture and engineering, it is generally agreed that the most important cultural legacy of the Romans was their development of law, of Roman law. Roman law emerged not out of theory, but rather out of specific problems, specific cases. Roman law consisted primarily of two branches. First, it consisted of civil law, which applied exclusively to its citizens. This included laws of the Senate and laws of the Assembly, decrees of the emperor, opinions of legal magistrates, and ancient customs that had the force of law behind them. And then it also consisted of a second branch, that of the law of nations. As Rome expanded, Roman magistrates began to incorporate elements of foreign law into Roman law. This led to the development of the law of nations, law held in common to all people, regardless of nationality, Roman or non-Roman. For example, slavery was recognized as legal. It was recognized as private ownership of property, and this was a law of nations. This was held across the empire. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the use of Roman law declined in Western Europe. However, Roman law would reemerge in the 12th century, and it would form the basis of common law in all Western states going forward. Now, I don't mean to imply that the period of Pax Romana under the five great emperors was completely free from all forms of violence and upheaval. The first and second centuries certainly saw their fair share of popular uprisings, political usurpers, bloody raids, and civil wars. But for the most part, outbreaks of violence during the High Empire occurred rather intermittently. A revolt would flare up suddenly, briefly unsettle the empire for a short time, and then quickly die out or be snuffed out by the imperial administration or army. The brevity of these revolts and the efficiency in which Rome handled them when they did occur was testament to the effectiveness of the Pax Romana and the Roman administration overall. The Roman system operated so well, in fact, that by the end of the 2nd century, everybody wanted in. Even many of the barbarians who were Rome's longtime enemies wanted to become a part of the Roman Empire. Many of those provincials who had grown rich thanks to the economic benefits of Pax Romana now thought that they should be running the show. Taken together, these two factors disrupted the Roman peace and led to what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. And we'll be covering the crisis of the 3rd century starting on Tuesday in class. Thank you guys for watching this video. We will discuss this next week when we come back into class. I hope everyone's fall break is going well. Thank you very much.